I'd heard the stories about Gravity Hill in Pennsylvania, the place where cars supposedly roll uphill on their own. It was the kind of local legend that you laugh about with friends, the sort of thing that sounds too ridiculous to believe but just strange enough to make you curious. So, one day, after work, I decided to check it out. I figured I had nothing to lose. Just a quick detour on my way home, a harmless test of an old myth. The road was deserted, as expected at that hour. The night was dark and cold, with only my headlights cutting through the blackness. I'd pulled up the directions on my phone, making sure I was heading to the right spot. Gravity Hill wasn't exactly marked on the map, but locals knew where it was, and I was confident I'd found the place. I approached the area, recognizing the subtle incline described in countless stories. There were no streetlights, just the beam from my car illuminating the road ahead and the shadows of the trees that lined the street. I pulled over, stopped the car, and put it in neutral, the engine idling softly. For a moment, nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself for believing in something so silly. But then, slowly, the car began to move. It was subtle at first, just a gentle roll backward, up the hill, just as the legend said it would. I couldn't believe it. It was actually happening. The car was rolling uphill, defying logic and gravity. The movement wasn't fast, just a slow, steady pull. I let out a chuckle, a mix of amazement and disbelief, thinking about how I'd tell my friends. I could already picture their faces, half skeptical, half intrigued. But then, the car's pace changed. What was a gentle pull turned into something more forceful, more deliberate. The car jerked backward as if something had grabbed hold of it. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the dark road behind me. But that's not what I saw. There were figures, dark, shadowy forms, barely distinguishable from the surrounding night. They weren't close, but they were there, moving slowly, deliberately, in my direction. At first, I thought it was my imagination, some trick of the light, or maybe just my mind playing games with me. But the figures were real, shifting and undulating like something out of a nightmare. I blinked, shook my head, trying to clear the fog of disbelief that clouded my thoughts. But when I looked again, they were still there, creeping closer. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat prickling my skin. Instinctively, I reached for the gear shift, trying to put the car in drive, but it wouldn't move. The car wouldn't respond. It was as if something had locked it in place, forcing it to continue its slow, backward crawl up the hill. I tried again, panic setting in as the figures drew nearer, their outlines becoming more defined, arms, legs, faces that were just dark voids where features should be. My pulse was racing now. I slammed my foot on the brake, but it was no use. The car kept moving, backward, faster now, as if being yanked by an invisible force. The figures were closer still, almost close enough to touch, their forms more solid, more real. I could feel them, like a pressure in the air, a weight bearing down on me from all sides. I didn't want to look anymore, but I couldn't help it. My eyes were glued to the mirror, watching as the figures reached the back of the car, their hands outstretched, almost touching the glass. I could see them now, clear as day, their faces a twisted mockery of human features, eyes sunken deep into their skulls, mouths wide and gaping, but silent. The car jolted again, and I thought I heard something, like a whisper, or maybe a distant scream, carried on the wind. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was all around me, inside my head, reverberating through my bones. The fear was paralyzing, but I forced myself to move, to act. With a desperate burst of strength, I yanked the steering wheel to the side, trying to turn the car, anything to break the pull of whatever had me in its grasp. The car skidded, tires squealing, but it didn't stop. If anything, the pull grew stronger, more violent, dragging me towards something unseen and unimaginable. I screamed then, a raw, primal sound that filled the car and echoed back at me from the emptiness outside. The figures were at the windows now, their hands pressing against the glass, leaving dark smudges where they touched. I could see their eyes, empty, black, endless pits, staring right through me. Then, suddenly, the car stopped. It wasn't gradual. It was like hitting a wall, a jarring, bone-rattling halt that nearly threw me forward. The figures were gone, vanished as quickly as they had appeared. I was alone, the road behind me empty, the night silent once more. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that if I did, the figures would come back. I didn't understand what had just happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. Slowly, I released my grip on the wheel, my hands trembling. The car was still, the engine idling quietly, as if nothing had happened. I looked around, half expecting to see the figures lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the empty road, the dark trees, and the distant hum of the wind. I put the car in drive, this time with no resistance, and slowly eased it forward, away from the hill, away from whatever force had held me there. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My eyes were glued to the road ahead, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just experienced. The drive home was a blur. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those dark figures following me, but the road behind me remained empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows of my house, trying to convince myself that it was over. I boarded the last train of the night, the kind that runs just before the city settles into the quiet hours before dawn. It was late, and I was tired, but I had no other option. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few other stragglers like me, heads bowed, eyes dull with fatigue. As I stepped onto the train, I noticed how eerily silent it was. No hum of conversation, no rustle of newspapers, just the low hum of the train waiting to depart. I found a seat near the window, hoping to watch the city lights blur by as we traveled. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to the soothing rhythm of the train, the gentle sway that would lull me into a half-asleep state until I reached my stop. But as the doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the train began to move, I sensed something was off. The lights in the train flickered slightly as we pulled out of the station. It wasn't unusual, just one of those things you barely notice until you're looking for something to distract yourself. I settled in, leaning my head against the cool glass of the window, expecting to see the familiar sights of Tokyo rush by. But when I looked outside, the cityscape seemed different. The lights were dimmer, almost as if a fog had settled over the city. Buildings were nothing but dark, blurred shapes, the streets below lost in shadow. It was as if the world outside had begun to fade, losing its sharpness and detail, like an old photograph left out in the sun too long. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. Minutes passed, or at least I think they did. It was hard to tell. The train moved steadily, but the usual sense of time passing seemed to have stretched, slowed down somehow. I glanced around the carriage, looking for some sense of normalcy, but the other passengers only added to the strange atmosphere. They sat perfectly still, their faces expressionless, eyes fixed straight ahead. No one spoke, no one moved, not even a rustle of clothing or a cough to break the silence. It was as if they were mannequins, propped up to fill the seats, not real people at all. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing moment. I looked back out the window, hoping to catch sight of a landmark, something familiar, but the world outside had all but disappeared. There was nothing but darkness now, an impenetrable black void where the city should have been. My heart began to race. I knew this wasn't normal. Couldn't be normal. I considered getting up, asking one of the other passengers if they noticed it too. But the sight of them, so still, so eerily calm, kept me in my seat. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, didn't want those empty eyes to turn and look at me. The train kept moving, the sound of the tracks beneath us a steady, rhythmic clatter, the only thing that felt real anymore. I couldn't see where we were going, couldn't even tell how fast we were moving. It was as if we were suspended in that dark void, traveling through nothingness. Finally, the train began to slow. Relief washed over me, thinking that maybe we were approaching a station, somewhere familiar, somewhere that would bring me back to reality. But as we came to a stop, that relief turned to dread. The doors slid open, and beyond them was nothing. No platform, no station, just a yawning darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. A cold breeze blew in, carrying with it a scent I couldn't place. Something metallic, like old coins or rusted metal. My skin prickled with fear, every instinct screaming at me to stay put, to not get off the train. But then, one of the passengers stood up. It was a man, dressed in a suit, his face pale and expressionless. Without a word, he walked to the door and stepped out into the darkness. I watched, frozen, as he disappeared, swallowed by the void. One by one, the other passengers followed, rising from their seats and stepping off the train, leaving me alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them vanish, and I knew I had to make a choice. Stay on the train, or follow them into the darkness. I didn't want to stay, didn't want to be left behind, but the idea of stepping off into that nothingness was even more terrifying. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be the last one on this train. I got up, my legs shaky, and walked slowly to the door. The darkness outside seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if waiting for me. I hesitated at the threshold, but something compelled me to move forward. As I stepped off the train, the cold air wrapped around me like a shroud. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing. The train was gone, vanished, without a sound, leaving me alone in the void. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Time had lost all meaning, stretching and twisting in ways I couldn't comprehend. There was nothing around me, no landmarks, no stars, no sky, just an endless expanse of darkness. I never intended to find myself wandering through Highgate Cemetery in the dead of night, much less on a night like that. The rain had started just as we left the pub, a sudden downpour that soaked us through within minutes. We had planned to take a shortcut through the cemetery, a morbid curiosity leading us down the old, winding paths. But as the rain turned heavier, we quickly realized our mistake. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the rain muffling the usual sounds of the city. Only the occasional gust of wind stirred the trees, their branches creaking like old bones. The headstones, barely visible in the dim light, loomed out of the darkness, covered in moss and ivy, their inscriptions worn away by time. It was the kind of place that felt alive in its own way, full of secrets and stories best left buried. We hurried along the path, hoping to find shelter from the rain. The shadows cast by the tall tombstones seemed to stretch and shift as we passed, playing tricks on our eyes. I tried to keep my mind on practical things, how long it would take to reach the main road, whether or not the rain would let up. But the atmosphere was too oppressive, too full of an unease that crept into my thoughts, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Finally, we found a small, dilapidated house near the edge of the cemetery. It must have once been a caretaker's cottage, but now it stood abandoned, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years. We took shelter under the eaves, huddling close to the wall to escape the worst of the rain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She stood among the graves, barely visible in the dim light, her figure outlined by the faint glow of the distant street lamps. She was dressed all in black, her long gown billowing slightly in the wind, and she wore a veil that obscured her face. But, even from that distance, I could feel her eyes on us, staring, watching. A shiver ran down my spine. There was something about her, something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. I nudged my friend, nodding toward the figure. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. He turned to look, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure in the darkness. For a moment, he said nothing, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that it was just a trick of the light. But then he nodded slowly, his expression tense. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I see her." We both stood there, staring at the woman, unsure of what to do. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there among the graves, her gaze fixed on us. The rain seemed to fall harder, the wind picking up, making the branches of the nearby trees sway and groan. "We should go," my friend said finally, his voice tinged with a nervousness that made my skin crawl. I nodded, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if something was holding me there, refusing to let me leave. I forced myself to look away from the woman, focusing on the path ahead, trying to summon the will to move. But when I glanced back, she was gone. The spot where she had stood was empty, nothing but the wet grass and the gravestones. I felt a brief surge of relief, thinking maybe she had been a trick of the light after all. Just a shadow cast by the trees, a figment of our imagination. But then I saw it. The shadow. It was still there, dark and shapeless, a stain on the ground where the woman had stood. And it was moving, inching closer to us, sliding along the wet earth like a living thing. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed my friend's arm, pulling him back toward the path. "We need to go now," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't argue. We turned and started down the path, our footsteps quick and uneven, the wet gravel crunching underfoot. But no matter how fast we walked, the shadow followed, creeping along the ground, always just a few paces behind us. Panic set in. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a cold, nauseating fear that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. I glanced back again and saw that the shadow had grown larger, darker, as if it was feeding off the fear, off the darkness around us. We broke into a run, our shoes slipping on the wet ground, the rain pounding down on us, soaking us to the bone. The old, twisted trees of the cemetery seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out what little light there was. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the cemetery, further away from the main road. My lungs burned with the effort, my legs aching as I pushed myself to keep running. But no matter how fast we went, the shadow was always there, just behind us, growing closer, darker, more menacing. I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my heart as the realization hit me. We were being hunted, chased by something that wasn't of this world, something that wanted us. The woman in black, or whatever she had been, was gone. But her presence lingered in the shadow that followed us, relentless and unstoppable. We rounded a corner, and I saw the gate of the cemetery up ahead, just a few yards away. It was our only chance, the only way out of this nightmare. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my vision blurring with the rain and the fear. But as we neared the gate, I felt something brush against my ankle. Cold, wet, and impossibly heavy. I stumbled, nearly falling, and when I looked down, I saw the shadow clinging to me, wrapping itself around my legs, pulling me back. "No!" I screamed, kicking out at the darkness, trying to free myself. But it was no use. The shadow held fast, tightening its grip, dragging me down. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me up, but the shadow was too strong. It was like trying to pull against quicksand. The more I struggled, the deeper it pulled me in. "Help me," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper now, choked with fear and exhaustion. But there was nothing he could do. The shadow had me, and it wasn't letting go. I could see the gate just ahead, so close, and yet impossibly far. The world beyond it a blur of light and rain. In a final, desperate attempt, I threw myself forward, using every ounce of strength I had left. For a moment, I thought I might make it, that I might break free. But then, the shadow surged up, engulfing me, and I was pulled down into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the gate, the rain pouring down beyond it, and the faint, ghostly figure of the woman in black, standing just outside, watching, waiting.